Japan up close.
I think there are some big changes coming for the US-Japan relationship, in part because of some of the security strategy that was just released in the fall, but also because as Japan increases its defense spending and looks to take on some new types of roles and some new missions, that is going to require the US-Japan alliance to also change roles, missions, and capabilities. We've gotten very used for several decades to Japan serving as a very capable shield for the alliance. And people often say then that the US is the spear. But Japan now is building some capabilities that will allow it to do both missions, right? To both do, for example, missile defense for Japanese and for American bases in Japan or for American forces at sea, while all at the same time having some counterstrike capability, right? Whether that's in the form of anti-ship missiles or even missiles potentially that have some type of land attack option. So that is going to require the United States and Japan to think a little bit differently about the way that we handle our own forces. And I think the big challenge here is that we used to have a very simple approach, right? Which was that Japan was largely in a defensive role. And if there were offensive actions needed, the US would be taking those actions. Now, with Japan having counterstrike capability, I think that shifts the debate a little bit. And we will have to have much closer coordination on those kinds of strike capabilities than we've had to have in the past, simply because Japan didn't really have the strike capabilities and it didn't have the legal mechanisms in place in some cases to be able to actually do strikes in the first place. So now I think what we're seeing is a positive shift in the alliance. I think it's good that Japan is developing these new capabilities, but it will require a shift in mindset in the alliance. Well, look, I think there's probably not a lot that Japan can do to fundamentally change the choices that China or Russia are taking, or even North Korea. So I think Japan's national security strategy, it has the right approach, which is that Japan needs to focus on a rules-based system and enhancing the rules, enhancing the system, and making it more robust. That has a couple of components. It obviously has a component which is to deter changes to the status quo by those revisionist actors, by China, Russia, and North Korea. But I think another aspect is to tie Japan more tightly together with some key partners in the region, right? Obviously, the United States is number one there, but we are seeing a lot of cooperation between Japan and Australia, Japan and India, with the United Kingdom, even with Italy now on a new fighter jet potentially, and most recently with South Korea, which I think has the potential to be very positive. And then finally, some quiet cooperation with Taiwan. So I think this is probably the way of the future for Japan, is to bolster deterrence against the three major challenges in the region, China, Russia, and North Korea, while deepening those ties with the rest of Japan's partners, whether they are in Asia or in Europe or elsewhere. So I think we're seeing some really positive progress. The reality is that as Japan builds up its defense capabilities and gets towards 2% of gross domestic spending on defense, that is going to create room for criticism from China in particular. That's reality. There's no way for Japan to avoid that. But I think it would be irresponsible of Japan not to step up more on the defense side, given what we've seen in Ukraine, given the growing pressure on Taiwan, given the new nuclear capabilities that North Korea is building, the more advanced capabilities that China is adding, and the nuclear threats that Russia is adding. It just makes sense for Japan to try and put itself in a position to be more capable, both of defending itself and of working more closely together with other key partners in the region. I think Japan is playing just a central role, maybe the central role, in trying to tie together the world's advanced industrial democracies, right? The G7 in particular, but also increasingly with a set of other democracies that are important, that are include some in the global South, like India, outreach recently to South Korea, to Australia, and others. So I think in that context, what we're seeing from Japan is real leadership and a lot of vision about where the G7 can try and uphold elements of the rules-based order that are being challenged. So I would expect that some of the top agenda items at the G7 are going to be things like economic security, right? How to make sure that supply chains are protected, that they are not vulnerable to both disruptions from natural disasters, but also from conflict and from coercive practices, especially by some authoritarian states. So I think economic security is going to be high on the list. And obviously, there are a number of key leaders in the Diet and elsewhere that have been advocates of a new approach to economic security. So I think that will be high on the agenda. I also think there will probably be a fair amount of discussion about ways that Japan and the other G7 nations can do outreach to the global South. Japan, I think, has been quite smart in recognizing that although many countries in Europe and in North America and some in Asia are pretty aligned on their approaches to Ukraine, that is not true in the global South. And so I think the US has a bit of a narrative problem on this. And Japan has been very smart in stepping forward and saying, look, we have to make clear that this isn't necessarily a battle between democracies and autocracies, but it's a battle to uphold the rules. And everyone has an interest in the rules, even if a specific country doesn't happen to be democratic, or even if it's a struggling democracy. That still doesn't suggest that those countries aren't going to want rules. Of course they will. And I think when Prime Minister Kishida was in Washington, he gave a speech that incorporated this, Johns Hopkins, that I thought was quite wise. So I think that's going to be a big element in the G7 meeting. And then obviously the Prime Minister is pretty committed to efforts to more responsibly handle nuclear weapons. I think this is going to be a big challenge, as for the simple reason that China, Russia, North Korea are all doing advancements with their nuclear capabilities, whether it's making nuclear threats, pulling out of the New START treaty, building new missile capabilities, or in the case of China, shifting pretty rapidly to a much larger and much more capable nuclear force. The trends in those countries are all headed in the wrong direction. So I think the biggest challenge that Kishida may have is that I know in Hiroshima he wants to make a pretty clear statement on nuclear weapons, but I think this is going to be quite difficult given what's happening in some of the countries in Northeast Asia. I think Japan has really stepped up in this regard in the last couple of years, doing much more, not just in Asia, but around the world. And obviously, Japan is in a bit of a special position here because it is the only Asian country that is part of the G7. And so that gives it entree into a European-led entity in some ways, right? You've got more European countries in the G7 than you do countries from the rest of the world. And so that gives Japan leverage that some other countries in Asia don't have because they're just simply not G7 members. And so I think the meeting in Hiroshima is a good example of Japan taking a leadership role with Europe on global issues. But we've also seen Japan doing a lot of cooperation with other countries in Europe bilaterally. So obviously the Japanese and the British and the Italians are working on some defense capabilities around a next generation fighter. The Japanese are also working with France on a whole series of efforts, some having to do with defense issues, others having to do with more political global issues. So my sense is that Tokyo has recognized that it's probably been a little bit too focused in the past on just the US-Japan alliance, but upholding the rules-based order means that Japan has to do outreach across the globe. And I think in the past that would have been a challenge for Tokyo. The sheer need to engage globally in a deep way would have put a lot of stress on the capabilities of Japan's bureaucracy and the like. But now I think Japan is really stepping up in this regard. Very active player in Europe, obviously has always been an active player in Southeast Asia, especially on the economic side. And I think we're really seeing Tokyo take on that responsibility. One final thought on this, which is we have to be honest that part of the reason that I think Japan is doing this is out of a concern that if Japan doesn't do it, no one else will. It's not impossible that we could get some leadership in the United States that's a little bit more skeptical of international engagement. And in that case, I think Japan will have to step up, just like it did with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? When the United States stepped back, Japan stepped forward. Japan has also stepped forward on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework to help the US push that across the line. And so I think Japan is realizing that it's now has to step up, because if Tokyo doesn't take a leadership role, it's not clear that anyone else will. I do think there should be changes to the Security Council. And the reason is simple. The UN Security Council was designed, 70 years ago, really 80 years ago. And at the moment of its design, it reflected the victors of World War II, but it doesn't reflect the top 5 economies in the world, right? So if you were listing the top 5 economies, Japan would be in, Germany would be in, Russia would absolutely not even be close. I think Russia is something like the 12th largest economy in the world now. And even France and the UK would be on the margins. So I think it is accurate that the UN Security Council is going to be, it's going to have to be reformed, or it's just going to be out of line with the times. Now, I'm pleasantly surprised that the United States has actually been willing to support reform efforts, right? To talk about adding Japan, to talk potentially about adding potentially Germany and India, maybe South Africa and Brazil. I think those changes would be wise. The problem, though, isn't the United States. I think the problem is going to be other countries that are on the Security Council that wouldn't necessarily be if it were remade today. So I imagine that Russia is going to veto those efforts if they ever came to a vote in the UN Security Council. I don't know that China would be supportive. And I'm pretty sure that France and maybe the United Kingdom wouldn't be willing to take a step back from the Security Council so that other countries could go on. So I do think the United States should be very supportive of these efforts. I'm glad that Japan is pushing. But I think the odds of changes in the near term are pretty low, unfortunately.
Japan up close.